Hello everyone, so I'm William. I will be one of the training officers alongside Robert for this year for the SSDC. Unfortunately, I cannot for the life of me work out how I'm meant to put my face on this PowerPoint. This technology is far beyond me, so you'll just get audio with PowerPoint. Regardless, so what we're going to talk about today is a little bit about active listening and BP. We put this in the introduction section because even though we may end up talking about some more technical aspects of BP, I do think this is a foundational skill that is necessary for debating, and it's probably one of the reasons why debating is a very transferable skill insofar as being able to listen to what other people are saying, understand it very quickly, and be able to actively respond to what you're hearing in a very responsive and very engaging manner is probably one of the central skills that you can use within your career when you say that debating is something you did at high school or university. So specifically just looking at this workshop and specifically why you want to use this workshop. Specifically, if you're finding that these three things are happening to you, irrespective of whether you're a novice, even if you've been doing debating for like 7 years, I mean 7 years is a bit long, maybe you wouldn't need this if you're 7 years. But anyway, if you're 7 years deep, and you find that you often end up losing debates because people say, or judges claim that you're unresponsive, may often claim that you're derivative. The special nuance here is if you don't know whether or not they're correct. Sometimes it's just wrong when judges call you derivative for obvious reasons, but other times you may be genuinely unsure why you are being called derivative, and there's maybe an indication that perhaps you haven't listened as strongly or as acutely as you should to what is happening in your opening. And often if for some reason you miss arguments, if you're sitting through an OA and a judge is telling you about clashes that exist in top half, or clashes that existed between you and another team, and you for some reason don't identify those arguments were ever made, this may be a key indication that you're struggling with active listening here. So if those three things are issues for you, this is probably a workshop that will be somewhat constructive. So if we look at what actually we're going to talk about, I'm just going to give you some advice on things you should think about and how you should go about thinking in debates, and particularly listening in debates, and then some exercises that hopefully will train you to become better at active listening in a debate. Obviously, this is all of my own experience. There is obviously no such thing as an objective truth, meaning that what has happened to work for me may not work for you, and may not be necessarily the best way to go about this. But the advice is the only thing I can obviously provide. So, before we get onto that, so what is the difference between listening and active listening? So I imagine you get to a debate and you're not just completely ignoring, hopefully, everything everyone is saying. You are listening to every word. You know the word the, you know the word comparative, or you know whatever the hell someone is saying. But there is a distinction between just passively accepting information. I think this is more critically seen as a judge, since a lot of people who are judges, particularly if you have a laptop, may tend just to write the entire speech down in front of you. And this is an indication you're not actually actively listening. So you're not thinking about the way the debate is evolving over time, how people are responding to each other, how different arguments are landing in the debate. All of these are skills and attributes that emerge from understanding what is happening, i.e. using active listening. So I think, at least to me, this is what differentiates a good debater or a semi-competent debater from a very strong debater. So those that probably would be the top of the tabs, those that regularly break. These debaters are those that can employ this idea of active listening in a debate. So yes, they obviously have naturalistic flair, maybe they have a case file, maybe they know all the best arguments. But more importantly than that, they are able to understand what has happened in the debate around them, because it is important to recognize not every debate will be the same, and being able to be as adaptive to the dynamics of a debate is important, and active listening is one of the skills that comes along here. Sorry for that freaky image. So, key elements involved in listening. So the first is to obviously just listen, right? This sounds very intuitive, but it is unbelievable how often you can just fall into the trap of ending, especially maybe you've done well in one round and you end up in a high top room and you get a bit worried, a bit panicked, and you're thinking about, I don't want to make a tit of myself. The hesitancy that is created in your mind can often mean you just end up writing extensive amounts of notes as a speaker or as a judge, and this isn't just helpful, right? You don't want to have, after Prime Minister's speech, or the first speaker, or whoever happens to be speaking before you in a debate, a section of verbatim of the speech that actually has been produced, because this isn't going to be constructive for you for obvious reasons. The second is based on that. You do want to write some things. You don't want to, unless you're, a daredevil, you want to have some essential information. With this essential information, what you're actually wanting to look for is the strengths and weaknesses that have happened in the speaker. But before you write this down, the important point is to think about this stuff first. It is far more important for you to have thought about the strengths and weaknesses and thought about a case as opposed to having written these thoughts down. Because obviously, especially university debating, it's likely that we all have some semblance of a memory. We are probably somewhat smart on the spectrum, but probably smarter than a normal person or average person, which means we probably can trust our memory insofar as if we have a thought in the past 15 minutes, it's very likely it's going to be there somewhere. So it isn't the case that we need to write it down or else it'll float from our memory, although that varies obviously. An important part of, therefore, the thought of this is when you are coming to write something down, what you're not wanting to do is just splatter the first thing that came into your head, but try to, as best as you can, summarize what has just happened in a speech before the next speech emerges. So obviously speeches are 7 minutes, and debating, a lot of things can be said in 7 minutes, but as you'll see later as we do one of the exercises, even in the best speeches, you can probably condense 7 minutes of speech down to 2 or 3 sentences, and we're going to learn some advice on how to do that. All of this, therefore, allows you to prime in your mind what kind of content has come out of the speech, and more importantly, what needs to be responded to and how it needs to be responded to for you to do well in the debate. So obviously after prep time, you'll have conceptions of arguments you wish to run. If you're very good at prep, you may understand the disagreements that exist in the debate and how to preempt those. But independent of those two skills, you could theoretically come into prep without any semblance of an argument, but being able to respond actively to what you've just heard is probably always a very good way to at least secure a very close second or third, or probably a win in most rooms, to be honest with you. So let's look at that a bit more detail. So when I say listen, and I'm not writing verbatim, the first things you want to do is, in this case, to unlearn bad habits. A lot of people who enter in debating form the bad habit of just writing down everything they see. What you want to do is to ignore this common instinct and just sit back and listen to what is happening. This is probably something you want to do actively in like training sessions as opposed to competitions. So I advise you, like when you do training in your local institution, to just take at least one prep session where you're doing one practice debate. Do it without notes. This is like, we ran a no notes competition in St. Andrews last year, and it was an incredible amount of preparation for Euros, just being able to trust that you have a mind and that you can think of things without having to write them down. So what you want to do here is search for the content that is happening, to summarize this even if it is headlines. And what you're trying to do when you listen is not just say, oh, this person's making an argument, it's a bit feminist motion. You're wanting to think about what are the weaknesses in the argument I'm listening to, i.e. if I was having a conversation with this person and I had the right to interrupt them, what questions would I ask them in order to clarify what they mean? These questions, every debater, regardless of how good they are, will make weaknesses somewhere, and being able to, at first point, expose these weaknesses is the first point to winning a debate. Oftentimes, judges will credit you for just exposing a weakness and doing a bit of rhetorical dancing about why your opponent's stupid. This is probably not a habit that you want to do that regularly, but it can gain a lot of traction in a debate, even just doing this. The second point of this is, the point of listening is to trust your memory, right? As I keep repeating, is to recognize that you don't need to have a piece of paper in front of you. If you actually just are honest with yourself, much as from my experience as judging, most speakers don't actually tend to even look at their notes as they speak. They just use it as a basis for jogging their memory if need be. So, first point, listen, don't write verbatim. Second, about if you are going to write, you want to make notes that are the most useful to you, which are going to be those that you can't necessarily read out in a 7-minute speech. You want to have a list of keywords that if your mind, if you're starting to jibble-jabble and you're starting to waffle, you can look at your keynotes and go, oh, well, I need to go talk about this topic next. So this is where you have some other things. Some things you may have here are things like substantive headings of what other people have said, metrics that other people have chosen to talk about. Like if you have a motion about like green central banking, and one team thinks the reason you should side with their team is because it increases the amount of investment in green energies. This is the metric to which the team is chosen, and therefore you already know within like 3 little words how to summarize that entire team, particularly if you're opposition bench, particularly closing opposition. You already know how to summarize OG in a very quick way and already target your speech in responsiveness to them. So writing only the essential information. So as a speaker, you want to think about, therefore, the strengths and weaknesses of what you've just heard. So these happen on two fronts. So on strengths, you want to try to steelman that argument as much as possible. Steelmanning here is taking the best version of this argument. So you don't want to write copious amounts of notes on all of the weaknesses that happen, because many speeches will have many weaknesses, and you can't win a debate necessarily by just pointing all of these weaknesses out if you can't make a positive contribution. So if you're able to find the strongest version of this and therefore be able to prime yourself on argumentation against this, this is probably the most constructive thing you can do as you're trying to listen to somebody else give a speech. Also recognize you'll probably want to focus on the holes of their reasoning as well, right? You want to try to ask yourself, why is this true? And does the speaker actually give me reasons to believe this is true? So for instance, if we're talking about a motion about like this House regrets Grindr or sex apps, for instance, and a proposition team is trying to make an argument that the reason we should regret these apps that allow people to have interact with random people sexually, they may argue we should regret it because it decreases the amount of promiscuous activity. So there are two questions there straight away, right? One is, well, why does it? And then the second question is, why should I care about that? Unless those two questions are answered, that team is unlikely to score very favorably in the judge's mind, and you, by identifying these two things, are able to construct a case or a response to them that attacks the best idea of them and also tries to undermine their case as they have presented it. Being able to know this as a speaker by actively listening is half the battle in debating. The other half is obviously coming up with a clever response. So we've listened, we've only written essential information, we've thought about the strengths and weaknesses. Now what you probably want to do when you're listening to a speech is to try to summarize this as best as you can. So at the end of the speech, you should have some few notes on what they said, what they went wrong, what could have been improved. But from then on, though, you need to remember that you aren't likely the only person going to be able to respond to this speech, right? Particularly if you're an extension speaker, which is the third speaker on either side of the bench. There's likely going to be two, potentially three other people that get a chance to rip into the speech you just heard. And it is very likely that you don't want to just switch off then and stop thinking about that speech altogether. You want to be trying to track as best as you can the responses that have come to this speech. This can look like a number of things, right? One, this can look like having summary headlines or summary keywords for ideas of responses you had and crossing them off when other people say it. There is nothing that disengages a judge more than hearing a speaker repeat responses that the judges are already tracked, even if those responses are good. You cannot double credit in debating, i.e. if your opening team is given a really good response to OG, you as CEO cannot give the same response and be credited. This is where active listening comes very much important in the context of BP debating, because you need to understand what has and hasn't been said for you to understand what you have to say. Here, therefore, you want to summarize what needs to be responded to and probably take them off when other people respond so you don't just repeat. Obviously, this is an art, not a science, right? Sometimes in debating, people can say the same things, but in a very different way, and often sometimes in a better way. This idea of active listening is not to give you a conclusive way to defeat every team, but this is a framework for which a framework of how you should start listening to speeches in order to try to prove yourself. Great, so you want to basically have one or two sentences to describe the crux of that speech as best as you can, allowing your notes to flow as the debate flows so you can track what is happening. This is obviously a skill that takes time to develop. You're not going to be able to do this immediately, but this is something that maybe you want to focus on using these 5 steps in your own training sessions. So all of this is geared towards priming your mind, i.e. you want to try to make your attention shift to the key aspects that are going to happen after that speaker has spoken. So these notes and these thoughts should technically prime your attention to things like keywords, ideas, and concepts. The goal here is to be able to think quickly of what is the best response and technically think if anyone else gives that. If they don't give it, then congratulations, you probably won the debate, particularly if your acumen is correct and you do have a good response. Obviously, as I keep saying, easier said than done, but having this for every speech and being able to hone and being very familiar with this type of active practice in debating is definitely 9/10 of the journey. So, key elements of active listening then. So we have to actually just obviously listen to the speech, but obviously the other 4 components are the active part, right? You want to minimally write, i.e. only writing the minimal necessary for you to jog your memory about what has happened. The construction of what you're writing has to be predicated on the thoughts you have about the debate, i.e. don't just write what the person is saying, write what your thoughts are about their speech. Naturally, this requires you to actively think about what you've just heard, rather than just being a passive acceptor of information. So thinking about strengths, thinking about weaknesses, thinking about responses that you could give to this speech. Using the analogy of imagining just having a conversation with this person, and you could have 7 minutes to talk to them about why they might be right and why might they be wrong, what you're going to say to them when you try to convince them they're wrong. Within this active listening, then, with your notes, you want to summarize what is happening in this speech in order to prime your mind about what kind of things other people might say, to try to make sure that you don't repeat what other people are saying. Great. So this is a training exercise, so that's basically the content of the workshop done. So here is a link that I will put, that will be in the description of the video. So this is a PM speech on one of the open quarterfinals of Euros 2021, specifically about green banking or central green banking or something. Essentially, the context of the motion is, should we allow central banks to use fiscal policy to help people invest, or to push investors into investing in green energy? So if you want to pause the video and listen to the PM speech, it starts in 1815. So within the 7-minute speech, what you want to be doing is trying to use those 5 things I've just talked about. So listening to what is actually being said, writing the minimal necessary, trying to summarize the speech as best you can, not just within its weaknesses, but its strengths, and maybe have some little ideas about what you think are good responses to the speech, and then, you know, unpause the video and we can compare. Great. So, pretty good speech, right? Not a completely airtight speech. I think I chose this video specifically to reinforce the idea that just because this person is I think it's Tahal, is a quarterfinal speaker and is a pretty notable speaker, I don't think this was the best. This is an example of their best speech ever, and I think there were quite a few somewhat obvious, somewhat nuanced limitations to the speech. So, what were the main points in the speech? As you can see on the right-hand side is some of the notes I would have made, or I did make when listening to this. So what were the main points here, right? I think there's probably 3 main points that he argues. The first is they spend a lot of time talking about the immediacy of this issue, why you need to side with proposition because there is a problem that exists in status quo, like climate change, that isn't being solved, and we need to solve this really now. Second is that, and I think this is the part of the speech that's very well done, is he stresses a comparative, i.e. he stresses what the trade-off is in this debate. That is probably not ideal on either side of the house, as in it's not a perfect solution. But on their side of the house, on proposition side, you get to use central bank policies that are insulated against lobbying, as opposed to, and here he pushes a comparative against opposition, that the alternative would be to use government policy to try to do the same thing. And he provides a few reasons why, which are listed under our palms. So he talks about how long in the future you think about these issues. So the central bank is probably more long-termist, thinking about the long-term consequences, whereas governments are probably short-termists. The weakness here is I'm unsure in his speech how he proves this, as in I'm not sure why this isn't true for central banks. They try to link this to lobbyists. Once again, I'm unsure why the central bank is not also victim of lobbyists, or is not a victim of lobbyists in a sufficiently insufficient way. Like, I imagine the government can still lobby lobbyists. I imagine central bankers to some extent to care about what is happening in the economy and may be irrational to a certain extent. So this is kind of responses that I would be primed for. I think the strongest part of their speech is when they argue what the kind of trade-offs a government would make as opposed to the trade-offs the central bank would make. So one argument they make is an opportunity cost, as in for governments to be able to facilitate investors moving towards green energy, they would ultimately have to undercut other types of programs that governments would spend upon, things like welfare, i.e. they would be able to afford welfare if they did this, and preferably they want to perform welfare because it's the benefit to the poorest, etc., etc. The question I would have after listening to this is, why doesn't the way in which a central bank will intervene also have this trade-off? Because presumably the central bank will be doing fiscal policies in ways that may things like undermine interest rates or undermine monetary quantitative easing that may make things like interest rates spike or like some other, general bullshit econ stuff. I don't think there's a lot of insulation in this argument, so I think there's a lot of angles for responsiveness here. I think the final thing they say is that the reason you should side with proposition in using the central bank here is it only harms the rich. I don't actually know why this is true. Once again, I think there are, as you can see in my notes, a lot of logical gaps in this speech. I think are very much resolved by DPM, so feel free to listen to DPM because I'm pretty sure they've progressed into the semi-final. But you can see just by actively listening to here, we've probably taken what may be on the face of it a very good speech, and by actually listening to it, realized it may not be that much of a good speech. I'm kind of dunking on this person. Anyway, so that's what went well, right? And we got some good responses. As you can see in the italics at the bottom, we have what my summary would have been. So I summarize this by saying this probably central bank policy shifted for more green consumption, resulting in things like less capital flight from developing countries, basically by co-opting liquidity movements to green technology on the trade-off of not sacrificing welfare budgets. This is obviously a steelman version of what their argument is. By having this, you can, as an opposition team, particularly closing opposition, know what you actually needed to defeat from opening government to win the debate. I.e., if you're able to prove, even if everything in the italics is correct, why whatever you say is more important why what that is, i.e., why you can shift to green consumption better within their own trade-off, that is sufficient to win the debate. As you can see, I have some things in red, which is what I would use to prime myself and what to listen out for in responsiveness to opposition, LO and BLO and MO. So how do the opposition teams tell me why they have better incentives, why they doesn't damage things like market stability, and why things like a fast transition might be a bad transition. Here I am priming my mind into thinking about what responses are going to come out of opposition, so I just don't repeat myself. So hopefully that has been useful. There's obviously some contents and exercises, and there's a very personal view of how I think about trying to listen to a speech. So obviously active listening requires you being able to understand what is happening in a debate by being very adaptive and being very conscious of what is happening. It's not just accepting information passively, but actually thinking about what you're hearing. I gave you some ways in which to try actively thinking about stuff. So not just telling you, think about what you're hearing, but kind of the things you should be listening out for. Hopefully implementing this into your own game and just your own debating career in general, hopefully will be a good step up for you to become a better debater. Obviously not being called derivative as much or unsponsored as much. But obviously we recognize that this is just a generally widely transferable skill, and if you are new to debating and you're considering whether or not to take debating up, I think this is the fundamental reason why debating might be good for you, insofar as developing this skill of active listening within a competitive arena, if you like that kind of thing, is a great skill to have, and once you have it, you don't lose it. And you can show off to employers if that's the kind of stuff you care about, wage slave, all that stuff. Yeah, so hopefully that has been helpful. If you have any questions, comment section, I'll be able to answer them. But yeah, hope to see you at Bogwall in future Scottish competitions.